Last month, a woman in Northern Ireland, where I grew up and where I'm from, received a prison sentence of 3 months for taking pills to bring on an abortion. She's been criminalised in Northern Ireland for wanting to control her own fertility. Now, some of you might remember some weeks ago, people rightly railing against Donald Trump, the American candidate for president, who said, when asked, he said that women should be punished for having abortions. And people rightly said, this is terrible, how horrific it is to have somebody say that. And yet in Northern Ireland, which is still, for historical, imperialist reasons, a part of the United Kingdom, a woman has been punished for wanting to have an abortion. This happened on our doorstep. So women are punished for their wanting to control their fertility. On the other hand, in Britain, if you get pregnant and you want to carry on your pregnancy and have your baby, you're also discriminated against. Recent surveys showed that 3/4 of all pregnant women face discrimination at work. And 1 in 9 lose their jobs because they have become pregnant. And bosses quoted things like, pregnant women were an unreasonable cost burden to their businesses. I don't know how they think humanity is going to carry on, because if women stop having babies, it's not going to go on very long, is it? But the bosses don't want to carry the can. And this goes to the heart of women's position in society and the roots of women's oppression, which I will come to. Of course, there is no question that women have come an enormously long way in a few generations, even in a couple of generations. Our lives, whether it's in terms of the law, divorce, abortion in many cases, and access to education, access to employment, even attitudes in terms of our personal lives, about having children outside of marriage, all sorts of things have changed in an enormous way, even in the last 50 years, to be honest. But inequality is still deeply entrenched in society. And I'm not just talking about Western Europe here. Actually, to be honest, across the globe, it is even more glaring, women's inequality. And women are, of course, around 50% of the population of the world, but they only control 1% of global wealth. That's how stark it is. Across the world, women's oppression can mean the difference between life and death in terms of access to resources. And when you look here in Western Europe and in Britain, I mean, there is just daily evidence that women have not got it all. Because sometimes people say, oh, you've got it all now. You're equal. What are you making a fuss about? I mean, this is a bit of a nonsense one, but it's still disgusting. There's a golf club in Scotland that won't let women be members. And they just voted yesterday, or 2 days ago, that they wouldn't let women in. They're obviously worried that they might spoil the grass or something. But this is, this is the 21st century, and there's clubs in Britain that don't allow women to be full members. But more importantly, in terms of the structures of capitalism, I remember last year speaking here, and I had just finished writing a draft of my book, and I said there are more people called John running the top 100 companies in Britain than there are women. Now, I had sent my draft around a few comrades, an early draft to get feedback and make sure, what they thought. And one of the comrades came up and said, I think you've got that fact wrong. You better go back and look, because I think it's in America that there's more people called John running the top companies than there are women. So I did look it up. And it's true in both America and Britain, there are more people called John running the top 100 companies than there are women. And you look at it, and the British government got a bit worried about this. The Tories, they care, and they said, we're going to have an inquiry into why there are so few women running these companies. So they set up this review, and to lead the review, they appointed somebody, Sir Philip Hampton, a man. They couldn't even find a woman they could trust, so-called, to look into the fact of why there are not enough women running the companies. And so you can see the intransigence of some of the ruling class to allowing women any access there. And I'll give you one example. The Supreme Court in Britain is the top part of the legal system in Britain. 12 judges, one of which is a woman. And one of the other 11 men, Jonathan Sumption, remember him, he said it could take up to 50 years before there was equality in the Supreme Court. And he said that women had to be patient. He said we have to be careful not to do things at a speed which will make the male candidates feel like the cards are stacked against them. But what about the women for over 100 years who the cards have been stacked against them? But of course, that just shows you there's some people at the top who do not want to let women go across society. So we start with, we want equality across society. We want 50% women in every job, top or bottom of society. But if we only did that and didn't address the even deeper inequality of class, we would end up with more Angela Merkels and more other women in the ruling class. Good, there's no reason why women should be denied access to those jobs, but we wouldn't address the question that women win equality only with the men of their class. So the women who work in a hospital as a nurse or an assistant will have equality with perhaps the man who was a hospital porter or something else, and the ruling class will be 50-50. So that is not enough. To look at society only and solely through the prism of gender means you can be going to cul-de-sacs, political and active cul-de-sacs. And I think that when we look at that also, I think if you just look at it through the prism of gender, you can be dragged into some very right-wing and reactionary arguments. Because the expectation that women are equal is sort of the ideology is quite entrenched. It seems like it's been accepted that the right and the ruling class often use arguments to say this is about women's rights. But you have to look below it to really to see whether it really is progressive or not. And I give the example, for instance, of the attacks in Cologne on women. That was used, horrible attacks on women, but used to say, look at these refugees coming here. They don't realise that we care about women. We care about sexual harassment. This is horrific. We can't let them in. Now, what I thought was brilliant to see a number of women activists in Germany get up and say, what about the beer fests? We get sexually harassed at the beer fest, and those aren't Muslims, that's for sure. But that sense of exposing the hypocrisy of the ruling class. But we hear it in Britain about banning the niqab, or not allowing the hijab, women wearing the hijab to do certain things. This is all about, but you're being oppressed, so we want to liberate you. Sadly, some of the left and some feminists go along with this as well and say inherently wearing a hijab is oppressive to a woman, and they also want to go along behind it. And we've seen that in France in a very dangerous way over the years historically, that this has been seen. But there is nothing liberating about telling a woman what she can and can't wear. Whether it's saying, young people are often told in Britain, your clothes are too skimpy, you look like you're asking for it. But on the other hand, women who cover up are told, we can't have you walking around covering your head and wearing these sleeves. What exactly is the right amount of body a woman should show that would satisfy these people at the top of society that want to lecture us? That's what I would like to know. It's our bodies and what we wear and our behaviour is under a spotlight as whether we're real women or whether we're liberated. So we have to be very careful. And I think the Islamophobia that can be peddled is often, the arguments are used to sound like it's about women's liberation. And in fact, David Cameron came under fire, another one of the many times he has, because he claimed that Muslim women were traditionally submissive. And Twitter went crazy. It was fantastic. All these Muslim women getting up and basically saying, submissive, not me, and giving examples of things they do, things they've done, resistance. It was brilliant. It really mocked it, which is sometimes some of the best things you can do to the ruling class. But also, Muslim women have become, under the spotlight every time, because actually, David Cameron also claimed it was Muslim women were the cause of young British Muslim men going to fight with ISIS, becoming jihadis, because it was the women didn't speak English, and this meant, and it's not true that Muslim women don't speak English in Britain, but he claimed they didn't, and this was actually bringing up their boys to become militant ISIS. The hypocrisy is just so staggering. This government, the Tory government that we're living in under Britain at the moment, they have cut back English as a second language classes. They have cut back even those who do want to learn English, who perhaps have come to it. They don't even give the classes anymore. So actually, on both counts, it's absolutely wrong. But I just think it shows you that often now, arguments that can appear on the surface to be progressive are actually reactionary. But let's get away from the top of society, where I said about how many bosses and everything else. Let's look at where most women are. What's you often called the sticky floor. You've got the glass ceiling, but the sticky floor is where most women are. Low paid, part-time work, and the majority of workers on the minimum wage in Britain, for instance, are women. And I've said it before over the last few years, but it's even more true today, that the austerity that is being shoved through the whole of Europe, and we'll come back to the EU tomorrow, has disproportionately affected working class and poor women. The cuts in welfare, the cuts in public sector jobs and pay and everything else. Women are disproportionately being targeted. Alongside that, and again, I'm always interested in the differences there are in different parts of Europe on this, but certainly in Britain and in America, a raging torrent of filthy sexist imagery and commodification of women that is in popular culture, that is in advertising, and that's also on many student campuses where there is lap dancing societies, pole dancing. You know, this is seen as being something sort of cool. You know, it's not even seen, like when I was a student in the 70s, these were things you'd go and picket and you'd spray paint their posters. These are seen as like ironic. You know, women have got their sexual liberation, they're assertive, so hey, what's wrong with going to a strip club? What's wrong with these things? And they're big business, they're glamorous, they're places that city bankers take their clients for a night out in the big clubs in the city, where they issue receipts that don't say where they're from, so they can claim their expenses and not admit that they've been to a strip club. But this shows how, you know, the commodification of women, I would argue, is actually worse today than it was 50 years ago. I think partly because what's good is we're more open about sex and sexuality, particularly women, but that means that in a society that looks for every possibility of getting a profit, that it uses that newfound assertiveness and confidence of people to actually try to sell back sex and sexuality and that assertiveness back as a commodity. So if people want to say more about what it's like with here, I think that would be interesting. But the big question is, isn't it, the faces, why is this? Why are women discriminated against? Why are women unequal? Why is there this sexism? Why is there this entrenched structural inequality? And lots of different, and I go through in the book, looking at intersectionality, at privilege theory, and looking back at debates that go right back to Clara Zetkin, Alexander Kollontai, and others through the 60s and the 70s, in America and in Britain, and actually look at all the different arguments that have gone through trying to explain why this is. And funny enough, one thing that often you keep coming back to is something that's often called essentialism. And what that means is really, and sometimes it comes from the right, and sometimes it comes from the left, and a feminist left. It goes along the lines of, there's something really inherent in our biology. You know, men, you know, with their testosterone and their different hormones, they are naturally aggressive, competitive, dog eat dog, warlike. Women, on the other hand, they're naturally more caring. You know, they have babies, so they care for their babies. They're more peaceful, you know, and they're not more warmongers and all the rest of it. And I want to utterly reject this sort of analysis, whether it comes from the right or whether it comes from the left. Because actually, you know, you get it around wars, you know, peace campaigners, women peace campaigners in the 1980s used to say, take the toys from the boys. Well, they didn't notice there was actually a woman prime minister at the time who had the toys. And today, who is in Britain the political figure most known for standing against nuclear weapons? It's Jeremy Corbyn, the new left leader of the Labour Party. So this is not war is not a gender thing. In fact, for young men to be sent as soldiers to war, they have to be broken. In boot camps, they have to be crushed in order to turn out to do the terrible things that soldiers do in Iraq and elsewhere. But then when it comes even to the economic crisis, and again, we've talked about this before, but actually, many have actually described the economic crisis as being a product of the male personality, you know, masculinity, competitiveness. Long articles in Britain said it was testosterone that made men do different sorts of betting, high-risk betting and all the rest of it. And, well, I just think, you know, we can wipe this out within one word, can't we? Christine Lagarde or Angela Merkel. You know, if anybody, they're not caring and sharing, they're not the sort of first words that come to your mind, are they, about these women? But they represent, you know, the idea that they are better at handling capitalism and better at, you know, economic crisis. I mean, Christine Lagarde was saying on the radio again, only 2 days before I came here, that if it had been Lehman Sisters and not Lehman Brothers, i.e. the first bank that went down, it would have been better because if women had been running it, it would have... Sorry, this is a nonsense. And tell it to the Greek women who are giving their children up to orphanages because they cannot afford to bring them up anymore because of what the system is doing for them. Yet, Marxists, socialists, are constantly told that really our tradition, our analysis, can't really explain oppression because it cuts across class. So how can a class analysis explain oppression? And so you get often this dual systems approach is called theoretically, which on the one hand, okay, Marxism is good for things like wages, exploitation, economic crisis, but for oppression we need something different. We need, perhaps in terms of women's oppression, we need something that's called patriarchy, that explains. And that means we need different sorts of struggles to attack and fight back against women's oppression. And it's true, on the surface, it can appear that oppression and class exploitation are independent and separate. And for the record, and I always make sure to say this because Lenin made it very clear, and it's absolutely right, we stand against women's oppression whoever it is targeted against. I am against activists who, go on placards and use sexist slogans against women Tories, or we're against oppression attacking anybody on the basis of their gender or their sexuality or anything else goes against our principles. It weakens us. So we're against sexism in all its forms, in all its expressions, whoever the target is. But actually, when we look at it, it is true that ruling class women suffer oppression. I mean, even the women I've mentioned often get, media talking about their clothes and their hairstyles, or whether they dye their hair, or how much of their bust is showing. There was our Sun newspaper, a tabloid, had the breasts, what was it, the best of Breastminster once, and it just had loads of photographs of women MPs and how low cut their tops. I mean, it's horrible, disgusting sexism. And so they do suffer sexism, women in the ruling class. But that doesn't mean to say that class is irrelevant to the question. Let me go back to the woman I began with, the woman in Northern Ireland. She was punished for being a woman and wanting to control her fertility. But she was also punished for being poor. Because most women in Ireland who want an abortion travel to England. She couldn't afford it. She tried to raise the money. She's 19. She couldn't afford it, so she tried to do it herself by getting some pills from the internet. So class and oppression are knitted together because oppression is rooted in that sort of class society. And not only, you see, do I think that the experience of oppression is utterly different depending on the class that you find yourself in. It's precisely the ruling class woman, actually their position in society relies on an unequal society, relies on the fact that even an army of women normally do all the domestic labour. I mean, working class women come and do their cleaning and their ironing and everything else. So actually there is no collective experience of oppression that is the same for all women. There is a different experience. And I would say that actually you can't appreciate or understand the full burden of oppression without reference to class. And only with reference to class do you understand the full burden of that. And I think that when, part of the reason for writing the book is to argue that Marxism is a unitary theory, is a theory that can explain the system and how oppression is rooted within that system, and how then that shapes how we should put the struggle. Exploitation and oppression are different things, but they are not separate and unconnected. And when we look at it, one of the reasons to try and understand this is they're connected because oppression is rooted in class society. Oppression isn't something natural. It isn't something that's been with us as humans in the whole of human history. It's something quite, relatively speaking in human history, recent. And I refer to some more recent studies in my book about early human societies and how they were, without any systematic or built-in hierarchies of any kind in terms of wealth or skin colour or gender. And this really upholds the general theory, not every detail by any stretch, but the general theory that Friedrich Engels, Marx's great collaborator and friend, wrote in his absolutely, at the time, and still really path-breaking book on the rise of the family and on class society. And I think that really what Engels did, and he was working on notes that Marx had written as well, what he did was really identify the material conditions, not the biology, not something natural, but the material conditions that led to women being discriminated against, on which rest all the ideas, all the assumptions, all the froth, if you like, about women and men. It flows from that material reality, because the ideas, they seem to have a life of their own about women, even within our own heads, about what we're capable of, or how we should behave, or how we should dress. We don't pop out of the womb thinking, I want to wear frilly princess dresses, or I should do this, or I should do that, or I can't be a truck driver, or I can't be an astronaut. Or boys don't pop out thinking, I love trucks. I really, really want to go and fight in a war. You know, they don't know anything about society until they're socialised and grow up in that particular historical period in which they are born. And so, what they wanted to look at, which is how Engels framed it, was how do these structures, that material basis, work? Well, even though the world is very different, and even though this institution has gone through enormous transformations historically, and it's, you know, the common thread of women's oppression across the globe is the institution of the family and how the family works in society. Now, that's not to say that we have placards, down with the family, it's all going to be okay. Of course, the family is a contradictory thing. We can find love and support and unconditional caring relationships in our families. But partly also because the expectations of happiness are so great and were brought up for that, they can be places of disappointment, of violence, of oppression, of neglect, of abuse. And so the family is a place where gender roles are shaped. And this goes to men too, because actually, you know, far from, you know, this is why patriarchy theory doesn't explain, you know, and can't explain the fact that actually women's oppression helps shape expectations that men are meant to have, of being the breadwinner and all the rest of it, being macho, being aggressive, being a sexual stud, and all these things, which actually most men either both can't or don't want to be. But it shapes the roles in society that we are expected to play. And it boxes us both in. So, on the one hand, the family is eulogised. Every advert and everything. But at the same time, the reality of capitalism crushes the possibility for many of us to have happy family lives. And in fact, austerity and the impact of austerity is making it even harder for people in families. But, you know, when you look at it, what is the family? It has an ideological and economic role. Ideology, I'll come to. Economic role, I'll give you one. I've got more statistics in the book, but I'll just give you one. In Britain, just on childcare alone, if it was being done by the state and not families, would cost 343 billion. That's 23% of the GDP of Britain, just on childcare. Families doing it for love, for humanity, for the people around them. This is something the state should be picking up the cost of and should be supporting. So the economic role, I think, is becoming more and more obvious and glaring with austerity. The ideological role, you see, it's interesting because if you look at families, the idea that there's a breadwinner man and a homemaker woman, well, it doesn't fit, does it? Actually, to be honest, for most working class women, it never fitted. It's not the case that for most life, you know, women have sat at home just doing a bit of cleaning and whatever, and ruling class women have sort of, you know, had their fans and lain on chaise longue and things. The fact is, lots and lots of working class women have always had to work. But the fact is, today, more women work than ever before. In Britain, we are half the working class. In America, half the working class. And the majority of adult women work for the majority of their life, regardless of whether they have children or not. That is a big change. That is something, in terms of reaching 50%, that's only happened in recent years. It was being close. So this idea of what the family looks like is very different from what the family really looks like. But that makes the ideology almost more important, because women are expected to still juggle and be responsible for the domestic sphere, which is seen as their natural area of life, and so therefore childcare and juggling part-time work to fit in, and it's meant to be, if she's not a good mother, if she isn't doing these things. It's not, oh my, why is there not better childcare? Why is there not better support? It's about the woman, it's about the family not providing. And so the ideology keeps coming back. And so today, for instance, in Britain, students have to pay for their tuition. I didn't have to pay for my tuition. They have to take out loans. There's times that they can't claim unemployment benefit. More and more of those students at college and students who graduated are still living with their mums and dads in their 20s and longer. This is a new change. So families are being asked to carry an even greater burden today than before. So it's becoming, even though it's gone through transformations, we're still told that it's our responsibility. And so if you're poor and you haven't got enough food on the table and you have to go to, we call them food banks in Britain, where people are given free food when they're poor, that's your fault. You haven't been working hard enough. You're feckless. You haven't taken responsibility for your family. Whereas instead, we would say, wouldn't we in this room, it's the Tories. It's austerity. It's the ruling class. But we're told that we're atomised. And so, cool. And so therefore, this idea of the family and where women are at, if you just stop there, you would say, my God, women have it hard, don't they? And they've got it even harder now because they have to go to work as well as carry all these, responsibilities. And even if people share it within the family, and hopefully, all of us do, it doesn't change the dynamic of how society is structured. It doesn't give, in Britain, there isn't statutory paid paternity leave, for example. It's very difficult for men when a child is born. Now, I know in other countries that's slightly better and easy, but it's structured for the woman to take more responsibility than the man. If you just stop there, you would think women are just drudges, victims, have a hard life. And funny enough, even bourgeois society, in terms of advertising and stuff, often acknowledges that women have a hard time. And so therefore, that's why you get these adverts about, go lay on a sofa with a chocolate flake, or get a big tub of ice cream and treat yourself, or go and buy a magazine, Tidbits, we have it in Britain, which is all about celebrities and, their bodies and their latest divorce or marriage or fling or something. It's almost like you need distracted from your hard life. So it's an acknowledgement of women's oppression in a funny way, but it's only in the most horrible, passive way of distract yourself with sweets and chocolate and treats. It infantilizes women. It makes their life as if it's about just in their head, about their psychology, about their experience, as opposed to it being structured in society. And actually, the other side of it is, as well as, all the women's, and there are sections in the bookshops in Britain, women's interest, men's interest. The women's interests are all of these tidbits and recipes for chock-a-mocka, this, that and the other. But next to it, each one is a diet magazine. You have to be a skinny supermodel. You have to look like this. So the constant, the unreality of what you're meant to look like, and you're told that the only way you can get through life is by stuffing your face. It's no wonder that 90% of all cosmetic surgery, which is hugely on the rise, is on women. And the most popular operation is breast enhancement. Because everybody knows if you're told to be a skinny supermodel, having big breasts doesn't naturally come alongside being really skinny. So then women are told, well, it's quite natural. And, there is 18-year-olds, a rising number of 18-year-olds in Britain, before they even know, they've not finished growing. And they think their breasts aren't big enough to fulfill this ideal of women who are having cosmetic surgery. And so I think that what we as Marxists do when we look at all of this is we don't just think that women are victims of this, passive victims of all of this, whether it's sexism, whether it's sexual harassment, whether it's unequal pay, any of the elements that I'm referring to. Because Marxism recognises women's agency. And agency, that's what's so important, is that we can be class fighters, not just victims of oppression. And I think that when I said that women are now 50% of the working class, and across the globe in greater numbers than ever before, this puts us in the social force that we as revolutionary socialists argue is the way that we're going to change the world. We're in that force now in numbers that we've never been before in history. And, it seems to me obvious in a way that actually oppression can be suffered most as an individual, whether in a relationship or in a workplace with a bullying, sexually harassing boss, or in sexual assault. It can be experienced as an individual, but actually, where do people feel most powerful? It's when they're part of a collective fighting back. And we've seen it in Britain when we've had huge public sector strikes, the majority of them women, some of them historically the biggest that have ever been of women workers in Britain. And when you see women on the march in that situation, they are, they are bigger. People grow, don't they? They blossom in struggle. They feel capable of things, and they're going like that to the Tories. They're not skulking at home. How am I going to pay the bills? This is terrible. And my husband has to do overtime, and I have to go out to work when he comes home, so that the kids have always got to, they're thinking, wow, yeah, we can take them on, and that is what struggle does to all of us. That's what struggle can do to us. But it's not just an empowering moment. It's real, it's material, it is power, it is something that can change things. And that's why I argue that the working class, when I argue, as a revolutionary socialist, the working class is the key to women's liberation, is not saying, come on workers, free us, we're poor women, we're here, we need you. We're in the working class. The working class is you and me, it's women and men, black, white and Asian, LGBT and straight. We are the working class, and we are part of the power that can turn society upside down. But of course, it will take a lot more than strikes and protests and even general strikes to get rid of women's oppression, to change the world. It's It's something that is going to need revolutionary change, of the sort that Wasim talked about in a previous session. That is the sort of change that we're going to need. And what's interesting is, when I've done meetings on women, you know, before 2011, I would reference the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Revolution. You know, now I'm saying, I was there, I saw what could happen. You know, I was reporting for a socialist worker for a few days and then went back at various times. And you saw it in front of you, and you know, I'm sure I bore people about it, but when you have seen the fact of women sleeping in a square in their thousands, when they tell you that they wouldn't even have walked there at night because it would have been too dangerous for them in terms of the sexual harassment and assault they might face, you can tell that when people take hold of their own lives and take hold of even just a square for 18 days, that it shows the potential. And the role of women in the revolutions was critical to how far they went. And actually, again, Wasim referred to it, that is why women have had such terrible attacks on them. That's why they've had thugs sexually harassing them and assaulting them in the street. That's why they have been tortured in prison. And that's why Mahinur El-Masri, one of the leading revolutionary socialists, is still in prison today because she was so effective, because she represented the unity. That's why I dedicated the book to her. Because this situation of women in the revolutions means that they understand the unity was a danger to them. You know, that's why in Yemen women were told it's not Islamic to march. They came out in bigger numbers than ever after that. And I think that's something critical. But the lesson of that is not that, oh goodness, we need revolutionary change. We better wait, we're not anywhere near what Tahrir Square, are we, in Austria or in Britain or, you know. Arguing for revolutionary change, oh, maybe we are. Arguing for revolutionary change doesn't mean sitting around and waiting for it. Because every struggle matters. The struggle to stop the NPO coming into government matters. The struggle in Northern Ireland to get legal abortion matters. Each of these struggles, whether it's about pay, or a sexist boss, or sexist language, or everything matters. Both because it can actually change the material experience of life now. It makes a difference if you live in a country with laws that say that it's wrong to do things like, you know, imprison a woman for wanting an abortion or to sexually harass and everything else. It makes a difference in the real world now, and we want that. We want the reforms. We want the system to be as good as it possibly can be for our lives today. But also because in every single struggle, the kernel of people feeling the confidence of realising if you step out of that little, what's the wheel called, you know, that a rat or a hamster runs on in a cage, if you step out of that, out of the grind of the Monday to Friday, work, pay the bills, maybe get a bit drunk at the weekend, then get up with a hangover, back to work. They want you just to have your eyes down like that, not having any vision of any other possibility. And that's what struggle can do. And it's struggle which is the driver of history. It's not ideas and books. We can convince people, but the driver of history is struggle, and that's why the ruling class is so scared of it. That's why in Britain they want new laws against the unions. They keep saying the unions are sort of dinosaurs from a previous age. Well, if they're dinosaurs, why do they have to keep making new laws to make it more difficult to strike? Because they're scared. Why, as Wasim said, is the ruling class, the ruling regime in Egypt crushing down on people? Because they're scared of struggle. And what I think is interesting, when struggles in the past, the ruling class can pretend they love it. I mean, in the autumn, a film came out, I don't know if it was ever shown here, called Suffragette. It was about the woman who fought for the vote in Britain. And honestly, to hear all of the parliamentarians going, oh, they're wonderful, these women. They had a dinner, you know, £90, English pounds, to have a celebratory meal for these suffragettes. And look at them, they fought the police. How courageous. They threw rocks through the windows of government ministers. Amazing. This was 100 years ago. It's safe now. But when the junior doctors were on strike, it was these people are greedy, they're killing people, we've got to stop them. Because they have to demonise people who are generally very popular people in Britain, you know, NHS workers. They have to demonise them because they face the resistance, it is a threat to them. And so, when we look at what we have won as women workers or as workers, whether it's the vote, whether it's even the belief in equal pay, but it's never been a reality, whether it's any of these things, we've had to fight for it. It's only come through struggle. The ruling class didn't sit around going, oh, those poor women, they can't vote. Isn't it about time we let them do it? No, we had to grasp it from their tight grip. And that's been the same for anything that we have won as workers. We've fought for it and we've snatched it from them. And that's why everything that happens in terms of Fighting for women's liberation is about struggle, it's about resistance, and it's about organisation. Because I tell you what, in future struggles, we know from history that the issue of women and women's inequality always comes to the fore, is always in the conversation, in the struggle, in the fight, always. The difference is whether next time we can win. And that's what this weekend is about, really. Building a sort of organisation with a political tradition, with a commitment to fighting oppression, that means that we can have a sort of revolution that doesn't stop with the army taking over, that doesn't stop with the state reasserting itself, but that actually that can fight for a socialist society in which not only will we win women's liberation, but because we can win women's liberation in such a society, we will also win the emancipation of all humanity.